everyone, and warm welcome to this seminar today on home-based work. We have an hour and maybe 5 minutes to really deeply go into this interesting subject of how low and middle-income countries actually also can be compared to a situation that we have had in Sweden maybe 100 years ago, or what do you say? My name is Sigrid Bergfeldt. I'm the head of program at the that gather all the Swedish trade unions in their development cooperation work in over 90 middle and low-income countries. Together we support unions in 90 projects to be stronger and more powerful in their fight for equal human rights and decent work. And workers' rights are, of course, human rights. This seminar is also on the initiative of Arbetarrörelsens arkiv och bibliotek. I choose to say that in Swedish because I think it's clearer for everyone. It's more known. Also together with LO, together with Unionen and Abf Stockholm. So it's a good range of organizations that are throwing this seminar together. And as you can hear, English is not my first language and not my best language, so any one of you that don't feel very comfortable in English, you can feel more comfortable with me as a moderator, because I plan to give you at least 10 minutes in the end to put some questions to our distinguished guests. And they will soon be presented to you. Just something on home-based work. The Swedish perspective of home-based work nowadays is actually a middle-class perspective. I think that when we think about home-based work, we think about peace and quiet from the busy hours at the office, and maybe we can work under more relaxed conditions, wear no makeup, or possibly wait a little bit for the plumber that we have contracted to arrive to take care of our leaky drain in the kitchen maybe. And to work from home is more of an advantage that the employer gives to the worker than anything else. But there is actually a problem with home-based work even in the Swedish perspective nowadays, and that's on the health and safety, occupational health and safety side. That is, of course, arbetsmiljö in Swedish. Because who is actually responsible for the arbetsmiljö when you're working at home? Is it the employer or is it you? That is a quite tricky question actually in Sweden as well. But to consider or not consider occupational health and safety regulations is, of course, far from the reality of over 600 million of workers in poor countries, poor and middle-income countries, that today work at home in production. And we have invited a broad range of guests to help us understand this perspective about home-based work. And in what sectors does it exist, in what countries, and how common is it? And does home-based workers earn a living wage or just some subsidies? And what about their health and safety? We will learn much about this situation with the help of 3 seminar leaders. That is, of course, Malin Nilsson that will start off. She's the researcher and scientist from Gothenburg University and at the Department of Economic History. And you have researched about the Swedish historic experience on home-based work and in the garment industries. And maybe you can tell us also something. What can we learn from that in the existing reality of home-based work today and in the countries where it exists in a large scale today? And what about the products that are used in Sweden that might be produced in this way? And we also have the distinguished Indrani Matsumbar, that is a scientist and researcher from the Center for Women's Development Studies in New Delhi, in India. And you are one of the leading experts on women's informal work, and we will very much looking forward to hear about your experience. And last, we will also have interesting experiences from Jane Barrett from South Africa, where you are one of the directors of the global network VIEGO, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing It. So VIEGO have been working for 20 years to try and better the situation for women in informal work. And one of the core lines of the work is also getting better statistics. Getting the statistics right, and is also to see the different important actors, how they can come together on this topic. Last, we will stop the seminar with a panel, and there we will also invite Magnus Kjellson, who is the head of International Department at Unionen. And you will also give us more on a trade union perspective and why we should care about home-based work here in Sweden. So warm welcome to you all, the distinguished guests, and also warm welcome to you all in the audience. And be sure to prepare some good and tricky questions for all our guests in the end. I will first welcome Malin to the stage.
Hello, can you hear me? No? Yeah. Hi! I am so happy to see all these people here and that there is interest on these questions or in these questions. I will start out by giving a brief introduction to home-based work in Sweden and the long history of home-based work.
It's a little bit.
Yeah, is this?
I think you lost that.
Like this?
That sponge-like thing on your mic.
Oh!
Hello. It's the sponge.
We lost the sponge.
We lost the sponge. Yeah, it's okay.
Like this? Thank you, Jane. Sponge problem. Like this? Oh, great. Okay, so when I talk about home-based production or paid production in the home, it's production of goods in the home of the worker. It's paid production for an employer, and there are many different labor relationships that you can do this kind of production in, but the two broad ones are that you can do it as an own account worker or as a piece rate worker. In Sweden and in Europe 100 years ago, and in many times today, it's production of kind of cheap consumer goods. So there's a lot of industrial homework or home-based work in garment industries, in industries producing umbrellas or silk flowers, or highly labor-intensive fields of production. Sweden has a history of about, I would say, 200 years of home-based industrial production. So Sweden was a late industrializer, so we have a relatively short history of home-based work. And in academic research, home-based work has received attention primarily for its role in the early phases of industrialization, what we have called proto-industrialization. But industrial homework was an integral part of economic development in Sweden and industrial growth in Sweden. It continued to be important throughout industrialization and up about until the 1970s. However, the sectors where it was an important change, and in the early phases of industrialization, home-based work was an integral part of the textile industry, while in the later part, so after like in the 1910s and forward, it became a very important feature of the garment industries. So in 1910, about half of all women workers, women industrial workers working in the garment industries were home-based. So this is a lot of people working here. 1 in 10 of women industrial workers, and the whole industrial workers, were home-based. And the absolute numbers of women home-based workers did not decline until about 1950. So they actually increased until 1950, the number of women home-based workers. Also male home-based workers, but they were a very, very tiny part of the home-based workers after about 1910. So I know this because Sweden was one of the few countries who actually have statistics on home-based workers. They were included in the industrial statistics from 1913 and stopped about 1970. Nevertheless, the statistics on home-based workers have massive problems as they're underreporting home-based workers to a very, very large extent. But still, as I said, we're one of the few countries who still have statistics on home-based workers throughout or for a large part of the 20th century. While many other European countries, and for example the US, banned home-based work around the same time, so around 1910-ish. They banned industrial homework completely, and hence they have no statistics at all. So they banned industrial homework, and it was part of a kind of a large social question called the industrial homework question. It was very much seen as a social problem. Industrial homework was seen as a social problem, and this cause was to a large extent owned by liberals and kind of the socially aware bourgeoisie, while the socialists and the unions were remarkably quiet in this debate. And so even the Swedish king was involved in this debate, while the unions and the socialists were very quiet. So he was like, this is horrible, we need to stop this. Unions were like, yeah, okay, we're quiet about this. For a reason, of course, because they, as with many other workers, saw home-based workers as competition, as unfair competition, and as, driving down male breadwinner wages. So they had a pretty firm stance in just wanting to ban industrial homework. But the fact that this question was so much owned by the liberals led to a discourse where home-based workers, and especially women home-based workers in Sweden, but also elsewhere in Europe, they were to be saved. They were seen as victims instead of workers, and they were to be saved instead of organized as regular workers. They were very often spoken of in terms of sweated workers, as sweatshop work, which you might recognize from today. We still use these terms. And the solutions that were brought forward, besides banning it, were targeting demand and ethical consumption. So there were calls for consumer labeling of the clothes made in home-based work. So actual labels saying like fair trade or sweatshop-free clothing, which, you can recognize from many of the debates today. There were also several of the actors of this debate also blamed consumers for their not sustainable consumption, and especially female consumers. That a lot of them pointed out that the problem was that if these young female consumers would not have so much demand for this really cheap clothing and buy this poor quality clothing, we would not have a sweatshop problem. So very few actors argued for organization of home-based workers as a solution to their problem with low wages and really bad working environments. And very few of them were organized. Very few home-based workers were organized. They would have belonged to the Tailor Workers Union, but women were not allowed there before 1907. Or they were allowed, but they didn't allow the sections, like the lowest paid, lowest skilled sections, where almost all women worked. So in effect, no women were allowed in that union. In 1902, a separate women's union, Kvinnornas Fackförening, were started and actually targeted these women. And in their subdivisions, they had a lot of home-based workers, or they would have, at least. Because they organized, for example, bow seamstresses or hat seamstresses or linen seamstresses. So they would have had a lot of home-based workers if they were able to organize them. And in 1909, the women's union were actually absorbed in the Tailor Workers Union. But unfortunately, in a study done in 1912 on the organization of home-based workers, only 2% of them were organized in any union. So it's extremely low degree of organization. And another example of home workers not being seen as normal workers were that they were not included in these kind of standard labor market regulations of the time. They were not included in the Occupational Dangers Act from 1889 or in the Occupational Safety Act from 1912. So home-based work were actually included in the 1912 Act, or the proposition for the 1912 Act, but they were excluded as they said that there is no way of monitoring these industrial workers. So they knew that a large proportion of industrial work was done in someone's home. However, the primary tools of these very early workplace protection acts was to have workplace inspectors, so yrkesinspektörer, who would visit workplaces and see to it that they followed the regulations stipulated in the act. But they argued, as there is no way to monitor work inside people's homes, industrial homework cannot be included in this protective framework. And I think that this says something very important about how work is viewed in these very foundational institutions of the regulation of the Swedish labor market and the foundation of the Swedish welfare state. That they say that we cannot regulate work going on in someone's home, but still, in the labor market, the two most common categories in the urban labor market at this time is domestic workers and seamstresses. So an estimation would be that half of all women in the urban labor market would actually be based in their own or in someone else's home. But what this says is that we cannot regulate that kind of work, and in effect leaving half of all women workers in the urban labor market unregulated. So if we sum up, I would say that home-based industrial production has had a long history. In Sweden, it's an integral part of Swedish industrial history. It has, however, been to a large extent missing from much of the academic research. It has often been very much underreported in statistics, and they were not organized and they were not encompassed by the regulations of the labor market at the time. Okay.
Thank you, Malin. Just a quick follow-up question. You said in the beginning that even historic-wise, men are not home-based workers.
Yeah.
Can you say something on your findings? How come that men are maybe still not very common in the home-based work?
So in the very early parts of home-based work, would be like in the early part of industrialization, in some countries they have been, and to some extent, and in some regions in Sweden, they have been weavers that have been male. But as the progress of industrialization continued, it becomes more and more female. And I think it has to do with, well, to some extent, that the alternative labor market for men grows, so the availability of higher paid in informal workplaces for men is growing as industrialization continues, while for women, the home becomes something else. It becomes something that women should do to some extent, that the male breadwinner norm presents them with, well, fewer alternative opportunities on the labor market, but also the family structure, which makes them take on more and more of the household responsibility. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very enormously important perspective, and now we have had a historic perspective, an overview. Thank you very much.
Very short overview.
Yeah, a very short overview, but still enlightening for me. So thank you, Malin.
Thank
and
you.
Please let me welcome Indrani Mazumbar as to the. I don't know if you should call this the stage. Is it a stage? Do you think? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Something like that. Okay. And this should put it on.
Yeah? Can you hear me? Right? Okay. Well, let me say that I'm very happy to be here, and I really want to thank all of you for having invited me also to this particular seminar. I have a long association in India with both the women's movement and the trade union movement. And in some senses, the organization of women workers in the informal economy, is it okay?
It's a little bit close, I think. The sound is not, maybe if we just take it a little bit further from the mouth, I think.
Is it okay now? Better? If I pick up, I might get too loud. Sometimes it happens. And I'm a Bengali, and we are notoriously loud. The Bengalis in India are notoriously loud. I'm sure you would also know of this. So, I was just saying that I have been associated with both the women's movement and for some years also with the trade union movement. And I have been fortunate in having this common experience. And one of the key questions that comes up in relation to organizations of women workers is, where is the venue of organization? And women's organizations, that is the mass-based women's organizations in India, have always used the residential area as their unit of organizations, whereas the trade unions had moved over the years towards the workplace as the center of organization. And when it comes to the forms of labor in which women are involved, and particularly home-based workers, we find that it is the combination of the two that actually works best. And this growing association between women's organizations and trade unions in this is a phenomena of the contemporary moment. Of course, you are all familiar with Seva. I'm told that you have programs with Seva. So Seva, of course, came up in the 1970s. It, as many of you would know, was born out of the Textile Labor Association, which was the Gandhian trade union. And Seva at that time distinguished itself from other trade unions in the sense that they were a women-only union. So this has been a debate in India, whether it should be women only or mixed gender. It's not a very prominent debate. I must say it's not a very prominent debate, but it is there in the practice of different types of organizations. And so far, the home-based workers, it is true, have largely been organized through the women-only trade unions, which is either SEVA or Working Women's Forum for some time, but that was the pattern. But the mixed gender unions have definitely become much more conscious of this segment of the workforce, and they have been organizing home-based workers for many years without having the label of home-based workers. It is in the sense, for example, handloom weavers who were primarily home-based were organized primarily by the mixed gender unions in India, not from today, but from, let's say, even pre-independence time. There was beedi workers, which was in, you know the beedi? All of you know the beedi? It's the poor man's smoke in India. It's a little bit of tobacco wrapped in a leaf, and it's now primarily home-based. But it didn't start like that. It started in sort of manufactories. So beedi workers, because the unions came in the manufactories during the independence struggle, freedom struggle, when it moved into the home-based segment, the unions also moved. But they didn't call it home-based work. I mean, they called them, but the first legislation that came in India, which defined the category of home worker, was the beedi workers legislation in 1966. And that was union-led, in a sense. And there the term home worker is given a legal status as a beedi worker in the legislation. But this is all, a little bit of background. The real point, I was asked to speak on garment industry, which is, of course, the rising segment of home-based workers in India today. And all our statistics, and WIEGO has been collecting these statistics in a very detailed fashion, shows that manufacture of apparel is the rising segment which is employing home-based workers today. But we are still, if you look at the overall home-based picture of home-based work in India, women are not the majority yet. They are not the majority because we have a complicated economy running through several simultaneous stages, and an economy where we are totally lopsided in our form of development. I'm sure many of you are aware of the fact that today India's GDP is 60% from services, but services employs only about 28% of the workforce. Agriculture, which is 16% of our GDP, employs around 60% of our workforce. And manufacturing has got a better relationship between income and, yeah? It is. It is, of course, inequality. She has asked, is this a problem of inequality? It is inequality. It reflects inequality. It reflects inequality. But it is a lopsided form of development that we are currently, this is our current situation. So in this situation, what has happened to garments? Some things, we should understand in relation to women's work in India, and that is, you see, we have a strong tradition of cultural taboos on forms of labor for women. For example, in most parts of the country, there are, India is such a country, there's always exceptions. So, when I say in most parts of the country, this is the reality that the woman is forbidden to plow. In an agricultural economy, the woman is forbidden to plow. There is, of course, a myth, our legends and myths add to this, which if you want, I can talk about it later. But anyway, the point is the woman is forbidden to plow. And yet, if you look at our country today, so this division between non-plowing women and other forms of, other kinds of work in agriculture, it sort of set a kind of segregation in the forms of labor that women undertook and other sections of, and men undertook. There was a segregation. The segregation persists in different ways, adapts to different situations, but this segregation sets the tone for a gender division of labor in the country as a whole. So you have a largely agricultural country where women are forbidden to plow, and the segregated this then gets reflected. We also have the issue of confinement, which many of you would know of. It's not true that the veil is common across the country, because in southern India they don't veil, they don't see, but it is very much there. And in our caste hierarchy is also very much part of our cultural tradition. And in the caste hierarchy, as you move up the caste ladder, the confinement practices for women decrease. So the higher is your caste, the less you are allowed to go out to work. The lower is your caste, you are part of the general labor, and women do tend to work. This pattern is actually changing, but it's changing in a way which we can discuss later. But anyway, this is our society, and it is in this that we have to situate our home-based workers in the garment industry. Now, let me say something a bit about the history of our garment industry. Now, it started, the industrial, what can I say? Traditional Indian wear does not use much tailoring. I wear this sari. Now I'm wearing a t-shirt underneath, but that's an adaptation, and most women would be wearing blouses, but this is of relatively recent origin. Traditional Indian wear does not require tailoring. You wear the sari, you wear the dhoti, or you wear the, you see, that is, I mean, it is no longer what is worn today, but I'm just saying that this is our tradition. And tailoring was largely just an urban phenomenon for certain kinds of segments of our society. Majority of the people did not wear tailored clothes. So, yes, there's no tradition. No. Everybody wears tailored clothes today. We are talking about a period, but the levels of tailoring have varied over time. I'm just saying, how do we understand the gender division of labor? And tailoring was a male profession. We didn't have the seamstresses. We had male tailors, and that's the pattern here. Now, what happened when industrialization takes place? When factories start getting, around garments. When garments get manufactured in factories, the first of which really come up during the Second World War. You may be surprised it is so recent. It came in the Second World War, basically to tailor the soldiers' uniforms. That's how industry entered garments in India. And that's how it was. It was a very small level of industrialization. It was not on a large scale. It starts picking up, this kind of industrial work in garments picks up in the in the 60s and 70s, when, and it is at that time that the export of Indian garments really drives the industrialization process. Because some of you may recall that the late 60s and 70s was the period when the India look came to Europe and the United States. So there was at that time, the manner in which garments were exported was merchant-led. So the merchant exporters, it was what is called high fashion, low volume. It was not big volumes like it is today. It was low volume and high fashion, and the merchants searched out the markets, and then they built a kind of informal production structure through what is known as fabrication units.
It's, I mean, in common language, everybody refers to them as fabricators in a place like Delhi and Bombay. Oh, really? Brilliant. So anyway, the issue is that this was what happened. It grew like that. But by the turn of this century, things have changed with the change in the global architecture of the garment industry. Now it is a much more buyer, monopoly-driven. Merchant exporters have faded away in that kind, in the form that they were there in the 60s and 70s, even during the period of the MFA, during the period of restrictions on quota restrictions on imports. But what happened was, in that phase, garment work really entered.
Industrial garment work really entered home-based work, and women were really involved in that. They were doing the thread cutting, you know, when the garment is, they cut the threads, they did the embroidery, and they did the buttonhole stitching, and it really spread from the export garment units, fabricator production units, to the home-based women. This has also changed. My own view is that in the present period, exports is no longer driving home-based work in India, in the garment industry. Because, and here, as the change in global architecture of the garment industry has taken place, alongside that we have also seen the demands that, you know, I mean, she mentioned the sweat-free, non-sweated. There was also a consumer movement here. So there was a much more closer inspection of the production process in India. And we have seen alongside this, we have seen consolidation into larger and larger factories. And the bringing in of processes that were earlier in the home-based segment have sort of been brought back into the factories. But today, in today's day, it is the domestic garment industry that is driving the increase in home-based work among women. And this is a singularly unresearched area, because often when we discuss home-based work in the international architecture, we miss some of these processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indrani. Wait, just a follow-up question. Very interesting to know that it seems that the scientists are not focusing very much on the home-based industry yet. And still you're talking about legislation, the first home-based legislation starting in the 60s, if I got you right, in India. And we also remember that the ILO took a recommendation in 2015. I think it was the recommendation 204.
Yeah.
And they are talking heavily on formalizing the informal. Can you see how legislation and all these recommendations have had an impact in India on the home-based work?
My own view is that much of the discussion on legislation in India has actually been pushed back. You see, in the 1980s, the demand for a separate legislation for home-based workers had really picked up. It had really picked up. We had a national commission on self-employed women in the informal and women in the informal sector. The chairperson was Ila Bhatt. It had recommended a separate legislation, and it had said that there were two kinds of policies required for home-based workers. One was for own account workers, who would require credit and market assistance, and one was for piece-rated workers who would require labor legislation and regulations. This was clearly enunciated in the sea. But you see, 1991, liberalization came. And the whole discussion on labor law has changed. And right now we are in a state of complete flux, you see. Everything is sort of kind of in a process of change. And people have had to sort of hunker down to defend just what exists. That's the level of the situation. So the demand for home-based workers legislation actually receded in the time that the ILO convention comes into existence. In India, the demand receded. And this is, I mean, a peculiar, paradoxical situation that you have the convention and you have the demand for formalization, you have a demand for regulation, you have demands for fallback wages, because what is the key issue before women home-based workers today? They are just not getting enough work. Because right now, India is in the midst of a highly gendered employment crisis. In the first decade of the 20th century, we have seen the loss of 20 million female jobs. And even home-based workers, their numbers are increasing, but the amount of time that they are getting, amount of work that they are getting, the amount of income that they are getting is shrinking. So this is our situation today.
Wow, 20 million is just a perspective. 20 millions lost work opportunities.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Indrani. And we welcome up Jane Barrett. You are yourself from South Africa and a director at Viego, but I'm sure that you can also give a kind of word perspective. Yes, now we're looking at that small... Kanske att du kommer och trycker på den där knappen. So Jane, you have also prepared some pictures from us for us. Yeah, it is.
Hello? Yeah. Okay, so that's on. Hi everyone. I'll try and keep to time. I know it's difficult, but I will try. Thank you very much for having all of us today. It's a particular pleasure for me because I was last in Stockholm, I think in 1986, when as a young trade union organizer, I was part of a delegation of trade unionists from South Africa who came to study your worker education system. So it's very nice to be in this building today. And yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to talk generally about organizing informal workers. I will make special reference to home-based workers, but I will also be referring to other sectors of informal workers. And I will make some specific reference to some of the international regulations around home-based workers. So I just wanted to tell you, I won't go through this outline, but if you can read, that's what I'm going to go through. I'm going to start off with just explaining a little bit about what my organization is. We are, if you know the global union federations, we operate a little bit like a global union federation, but we're not exactly a global union federation. Our objective is to promote and support the increase in the voice, the visibility, and the validity, the recognition of informal workers, particularly women informal workers. And we work in 4 particular sectors: waste picking or recycling, home workers, including all kinds of home workers, domestic workers, and the reason for that is that many domestic workers are still working in an informal way in most parts of the world, as well as street vendors. So we work in 4 sectors, but our work sometimes drifts into related sectors. And the work that we do is we build and support international networks within these 4 sectors. So, for example, we were very involved in the establishment of the International Domestic Workers Federation, which is a global union federation, which is a GUF. And also StreetNet International, which itself is also a global union federation. It's an international body with affiliates of street vending organizations, and we have regional networks of home-based workers and regional networks of waste pickers. So that's part of the work that we do, but we also assist in supporting national and local organizations of informal workers in those sectors. And we do it through 5 different programs, one of which is the organizing program which I'm involved in. But we also do research, we have a strong statistical orientation, we do a lot of work on social protection and on law, all of which ultimately feeds into the organizing process. So our starting point is the dignity of work, whether it's formal or whether it's informal. And this is a picture of a waste picker in Pune in India. She's a member of the KKPKP trade union, which is based in Pune, India. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of the scale of informal work, and the reason for showing you this is it's always a little bit of a shock to realize that in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, we have levels of around 10% of informal employment. Western Europe, the figure will be even lower. But then going right up to South Asia, 82% of workers in work or involved in economic activity are in informal employment, which is a staggering proportion. And those workers are largely invisible, unrecognized by regulation, by authorities, and often even not recognized until relatively recently by the trade union movement. And so you will see the figures for the different regions, 66% in sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. So what is the informal economy? And the informal economy is slightly different to informal work. Many people are working in the formal economy, but on an informal basis. But then we can distinguish between the formal economy and the informal economy. So the informal economy is where workers make their own work. And this is particularly what is characteristic of the informal economy. The risks are higher and incomes are lower, particularly the health risks. And the economic contribution, although worldwide we've got relatively reliable statistics on informal employment, the contribution of workers in the informal economy to the gross domestic products, the statistics are very, very unreliable. And in many countries just simply don't exist. So the estimate is about 50% of GDP in developing countries comes from the informal economy. And again, the informal economy is generally invisible to the authorities. It's not engaged in any way in terms of regulation and so forth, except to try and control it. So control over street vending from the point of view not of encouraging the economic activity, but from the point of restricting the economic activity. So just some global examples of people working in the informal economy and working on an informal basis. Craft workers in Bulgaria, market vendors in Tanzania, who are both producing the clothes that they sell and then selling it in the market. Shoe shiners in Mexico City. But to make the point that not all informal workers are exactly the same. So when we organize, we have to recognize levels of differentiation between different kinds of workers, between workers in different sectors, and also within sectors. And one of the key elements of that differentiation is a gender differentiation. So you find some sectors in the informal economy are predominantly men or predominantly women. And you find that the sectors where women dominate tend to be the lower income sectors. And then within the sectors, you find further differentiation by occupation. So for example, in market vending or street vending, women often sell the perishables, the fruit and the vegetables. Men sell the durables, the electronic equipment and so forth. The higher value, and so they're getting a better income. In waste picking, you find the women tend to get kind of pushed into collecting and selling cardboard and plastics, and the men dominate in collecting and selling metals, the higher value products. So just as in the formal economy and formal employment, you get this gender differentiation and genderization of the division of labor, it happens in the informal sector as well. And then you find that women are facing additional risks, just as they do in formal employment, but in informal employment it's exaggerated because of the lack of property rights generally, sexual harassment, the absence of childcare is often a serious barrier to sustainable livelihood. How do you sustain your income as a street vendor when you have to have your child next to you when it's preschool or even when the child is ready for school, having to come and join you in your activity on the street? And so our argument as we go is these are issues which we have to take into account when we do our organizing and organizing support with the organizations that we work with, and in our negotiation processes. Because negotiation for us is very much part of the process of organizing. And people often ask the question, well, how do you negotiate when there isn't an employer? It's a kind of mystery to people who are familiar only with the formal trade union movement. And the negotiations that we refer to are with local authorities for improved access to infrastructure. So if you're a home-based worker, you need clean water, you need electricity. These are the kinds of demands that informal workers have. So the negotiating partner becomes the local authority or other authorities, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Just to show you some illustrations of the gendered differentiation. These two pictures are in Ahmedabad, just around the corner from each other. The one on the left is a beedi roller, and she's sitting on the front step of her house. That's the only place she has to work, and she's rolling her beedi. On the right you have the men from the same locality making wheels in a covered workshop, working with metals. And in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, another image, the women are selling bananas to people in the taxi, and the men are driving what are called borders. They are motorbike taxis, sort of higher income informal work. So what do informal workers want, and what is it that their organizations organize around? Decent income, number one, to be made possible by acquiring legal identity and rights, as well as social recognition as workers. Because the absence of social recognition is a contributing factor to keeping incomes low. Social rights and social protection, including health and childcare, because in most countries, because informal work is not recognized as work, those workers are excluded from social protections, from unemployment insurance, maternity benefits, and so on. Access to basic infrastructure and education and skills training. And of course, it's through organizing and building organizational power and collective bargaining that these things are fought for and won in some cases. So who's the bargaining partner? Well, it depends on where the workplace is. In the case of the street vendors, it's generally speaking the local authority. For industrial outwork, for home-based worker, it would be subcontracted, it would be the firm or the local authority in terms of infrastructure. For domestic workers, you're working in somebody else's home. The employer is usually an individual, and so forth. So who the bargaining partner is depends very much on where the place of work is. I won't talk about this now because I can see I'm running out of time. But just to give you a couple of images of organizing. The first one I want to share with you is SETEP, which you may not have heard of. It's a very new movement in Argentina, an amazing movement, mass movement of hundreds of thousands of workers across the informal economy, and it works closely with the two trade union federations. They have had many successes in the course of about 5 years, including winning childcare rights, winning an income for waste pickers, and so forth. And then there's the example of waste pickers working in Pune in India, who are members of the union but are also using the cooperative model of organizing. Waste pickers in Johannesburg, who are organizing to win recognition into the waste collections system. Then there is Sewa in India, and I know you're going to hear a little bit more about that, so I won't spend too much time on this. Sewa, having existed since 1971, has a huge range of services, and a lot of their model is based on self-help, which is a particular kind of organizing model. Childcare, cooperatives, a pharmacy cooperative, and so on. Shoe shiners organizing in Mexico City, and I thought I would share this wonderful picture with you of what are called mariachis in Mexico City, the musicians who are unionized. And then we have international organizing, and I see that I really do have to close up. So these are all pictures from the international trade union organizations that we work with, which I will just flip through the images. And sadly, I don't have time to tell you about the HomeNet regional organizations, but just to conclude that if informal workers don't organize, they don't have power. If they don't negotiate, they don't win improvements in their livelihoods. So those are the sort of main messages about organizing, leading to negotiating power.
Thank you very much, Jane. It was
much.
so interesting. While I'm begging the other lecturers, including Magnus, to come up to the stage for a small panel, so please put your mic right back, and you can all come up. I would just like to have a follow-up question, Jane, because you were talking about how organizing can be quite tricky in the informal work and in the home-based work that is more connected to the formal sector as well. But still, can you give us an example where you think that a specific trade union have been overcoming all those difficulties? Because we know that trade unions normally follow formal situations in the area of work, and that it can be very challenging, really, for ordinary trade unions to get a grip on the informal market.
you want an example of a formal trade union?
Yeah, a formal trade union that you think that have been successful in tackling the problem of informal work.
Okay, I'll give you, the question was to give an example of a formal trade union that has successfully organized informal workers, and I'll give a very contemporary example in a sector which isn't actually a WIGO sector, but it's the transport sector in Uganda, where through liberalization in the sort of from about 15 years ago, the public sector transport worker sector was privatized and eventually just collapsed. The bus sector collapsed. The commuter trains just disappeared. And what came into the vacuum was those motorbike taxis, the borders. But the union of the formal workers just started to shrink from being a union of about 35,000 workers. In the space of 10 years, it suddenly had about 4,000 members. And in response, partly because they became anxious they would just disappear, they started to organize the border workers. And in the space of about 3 years, they now have organized about 70,000 border workers. So from being a union of 3,000, they suddenly grew to 75,000. And it's presented problems in transition for the union. But what's interesting is in the process, they've also started to grow their formal sector membership. So both their informal membership has mushroomed, but their formal sector membership has also grown. This is a very, very interesting and documented example of how a formal trade union is adapting in particular circumstances, and they're beginning to win certain rights for those border workers.
Thank you very much. Interesting example. And Magnus Kjellson, you're actually the head of the international department at Unionen. And why should Unionen care about informal workers in other countries?
There are, of course, many reasons why we should care. I think that the quick answer would be solidarity, of course. I mean, we're a part of the global union movement, and together with IF Metall, we are doing work together with SEVA, supporting SEVA.
Yeah. In your case, the mic needs to be very close, it seems. And
Okay.
Yeah, good.
So, from a union point of view, I mean, we see a growth of the informal economy in many ways, and actually it's not only about this context. We see a growth of the informal economy in many different sectors and trades. And if you look at the loose bounds with an employer or with an employment today, I mean, a software developer in California could do a similar, in that sense, work to a textile worker in Ahmedabad or wherever, because you could work from home, you could work close to piece by piece work also in other parts of the economy. So I think home-based work is growing as a general trend of tomorrow's labor market also. Of course, the conditions differ a lot, of course, between a software developer in California and a textile worker in India. But however,
I think you need to choose.
I try this one instead. So I think what we normally consider as the traditional workplace is in breakdown. And that's quite interesting, and it's a huge challenge, I would say, for unions, and it's a huge challenge for the social dialogue in general. Despite this challenge, I would like to say that I think the only actor that can bring change to the informal economy is actually the unions, that could build credibility and trust with the different stakeholders to try to change the conditions in the labor market. So it's essential, and I think it's an underestimated task by the unions to try to tackle this challenge. finding strategies to work more effective in an informal economy. And I think that SEVA in India, as you have heard about before today, has actually been able to do this in a very successful way. Collective bargaining, maybe not in the way that we usually think of it, but collective bargaining more related to government, more related to authority, as was just mentioned also before. And the way they have managed the case of giving identification cards to hundreds of thousands of female workers is absolutely amazing. So I think SEVA is doing a great job. Been around for a long time, and there's also a lot that we could learn from SEVA in this extent. And of course, I mean, for us it's about also trying to support a female union leadership. It's so necessary for the global union movement to get more female involved from many different aspects. Of course, there's a lot of challenges, and I can say if things are bad in Sweden, it's even worse in India. So I don't think that there is a contradiction. We need to do work, I think, on both sides.
Nu får du får vänta lite grann, så kan det behöver du inte göra, men däremot så kan vi få lyssna färdigt på Magnus Kjellson som är inbjuden.
I don't think there's any contradiction between trying to improve the conditions in India, for example, and trying to improve the conditions in Sweden. And of course, many of you might know that Unionen also very clearly supports social dialogue and the global deal as initiated by the Swedish government, and trying to find, I mean, new platforms for this kind of work, to organize the self-employed and find new ways of social dialogue. I think it's so essential. So just to wrap it up, what we're doing, we are supporting SEVA to organize the organizing strategy. We're having a leadership exchange between female union leaders from both Unionen and IF Metall with SEVA, training young SEVA leaders, and also helping SEVA, of course, with doing a better work and use new technology also to be better at organize and gathering and put forward the social dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus. And we're running out of time, but for those of you that can stick around for a couple of minutes more, I think that we would be very interested in hearing questions from the audience instead of me starting to give more questions. So anyone that is up for
I have a very important question. We have been so worried about child labor in many parts of the world, poor little children forced to weave carpets, for example. And how about the situation today for the children?
Thank you so much. Who is up for answering?
I think you're referring particularly to India, because the carpet weaving child labor is an Indian example. The issue of child labor is, of course, still a live issue. And I would like to say that in home-based work, there's a lot of child participation in the labor process. But it's a real issue. There's a lot of actions being taken to restrict child labor in India. And there are good signs in the sense that we have seen an enormous uptake in enrollment in education. There are things that are changing because as the economy is changing, as people's lives are changing, old systems and old patterns of living are no longer viable for people, so they are looking for new things. And in that process, the education element is really being pushed, both for girls as well as boys. So, I mean, the issue will continue to remain, and restrictions will have to be put in place, and continuous processes will go on. But there are signs of a lot of change taking place. I mean, we are a country with mass poverty. And mass poverty is what drives child labor. So we have to address that question.
Yes, hello, and thank you for a good lecture. I recently arrived from the ILO conference of 2017, and I was shocked by the fact that nobody from the laborers in the labor movement in Sweden or in the ILO talked about the situation of people who suffer from schizophrenia, and the labor how people who suffer from schizophrenia, how we can employ these people to get a job, how they can become a part of the labor movements. Do you have any ideas?
It's maybe broaden on psychological or neuropsychological disabled people, or yeah, with schizophrenia. Okay, was this a little bit specific, but maybe someone is up to.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, I think that mental health generally is a very it's an issue which is not given enough attention in the workplace generally, whether it's at national level or international level. So most of the recommendations and conventions of the ILO that deal with health don't really talk about psychological health. So I think there's a big job to be done there. But it's also important to understand that every year at the ILO convention, at the conference, the ILC, there's a very limited agenda. So it's planned in advance, and there will be very specific agenda items. So I know one of the items this year was violence at work. And one would hope that in that area there would be some discussion around mental health and violence. Whether that would go to the specifics of schizophrenia, I don't know. But I guess for a trade unionist it would be a question of trying to look at the agenda, the 3 or 4 items on the agenda, and saying, how can I take the interest that my union has into that agenda? And if there's a disability or health workers' rights lobby within your own trade union, to push for the specific issues. So, you know, but you have to take the long view to try and get your issues into those international discussions.
So one final question before we wrapping up this seminar. No? So I guess that's mine. So just quickly, a quick round for all 4 of you. Do you think that home-based work will increase or decrease in the coming 20 years' time? I think you have already answered, Magnus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it will. I think it will increase. I think history shows us that it's something that, if it's profitable, if the technical specificities are there, it will increase. It will decrease over time. But I think it will increase at least in the next 100 years.
Well, the signs in India are that it's increasing. So, but I also agree that there will be ebbs and flows as far as that is concerned. And the problem is, you know, when you're brought into some kind of work and then you're just dropped out, that is an issue which has to be addressed even for home-based workers.
Yeah, just to say, regardless of what sectors it might start growing or shrinking in, you know, the ILO has this Convention 177, which is supposed to be taken up by governments to regulate employment relationships in home-based work. That's where there is an employer, so where there's a subcontracting arrangement. And it's virtually ignored by most governments. So, you know, one of the tasks of the trade union movement going forward, regardless of how it shrinks or grows, the home worker issue, will be to push for, firstly, for recognition of the home worker as a worker, and extension of rights, and using the convention to guide what those rights should be. That the problem with the ILO is that the conventions remain sort of up in the air as wish lists. But we have to, as trade unionists, really try and push that those rights get implemented in local law. And these areas of growing homework, particularly in technology, might be a good place to really start pushing in the north, and that may have a good impact globally.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience that you have come today. Very interesting. Thanks. Please, if you want to pick some more information on home-based work and other issues.